listening to The Switch. The Switch is a podcast about ideas and experiences that change our minds. I'm Chase Harris, joined as always by my co-host, Alex Berner. In this episode, we speak with Noah Rasheta. Noah is the host of the Secular Buddhism podcast. He's also the author of 2 books, Secular Buddhism, Eastern Thought for Western Minds, and No-Nonsense Buddhism for Beginners, Clear Answers to Burning Questions About Core Buddhist Teachings. In this conversation, we talk about Noah's story, how he came to study Buddhism, and some of the philosophy and insights related to Buddhism, mindfulness, and meditation practice.
If you like what we do here on The Switch, the best way to support us is through Patreon. For as little as $1, you can become part of the community. Ask us questions, suggest topics, and directly communicate with us. You can also unlock bonus content like extra questions we ask our guests. If you want more of The Switch, both on topic and off, you can become a patron at www.patreon.com/switch_podcast.
You can also support us by rating and reviewing on the various podcast platforms, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or wherever you happen to listen to it. If you want to see us on social media, you can check us out on Instagram and Twitter. We are at Switch_podcast. And on Facebook, we are The Switch Podcast.
The Switch is produced by Mojo Filter Media, a company specializing in audio production for video games and interactive media. You can check out our website at www.mojofilter.media.
And so, without further delay, we start with a story from Alex's life.
When I lived in LA for a few months, I didn't have a car, so I met a lot of interesting people from all over the world in my Uber rides. One of these people was a man who was a fairly conservative Muslim, and in the car ride, the subject of God soon came up, and I was presented with the very loaded question of, "You believe in God, right?" My answer clearly made him very distressed, and his ideas about the world started to pour out. Because of my practice of mindfulness meditation, I was able to better listen to what he had to say and not judge. I listened to his points about the Illuminati. I listened to his opinions about the deterioration of morality in my generation. As I continued to listen, his points became more personal. He spoke about his wife who had left him and his children who he could barely provide for, how very few had so much and how so many had so little. I heard him talk about the kind of personal struggles that all of us have at one point or another, and on that point we connected. Beneath all of the ideas about the world, he felt an inherent unsatisfactoriness about life, a feeling that I had always felt before I began my meditation practice. I told him about my life, and how a seemingly simple practice had helped me become more aware, compassionate, and peaceful. He believed that Buddhism would conflict with his faith, and that it was off limits, but I explained to him that secular approach to Buddhism had no implications on your God or religion, and his faith could remain intact while still benefiting from the practice. I explained to him the gist of a quote from a Dalai Lama: "Do not try to use what you learn from Buddhism to be a Buddhist, use it to be a better whatever you already are." Because of the lessons I learned from Buddhism, I was left with a feeling of connection to a man who at first glance was very different than myself, and because of the secular nature of my practice, I was able to hopefully transfer these skills over to him. I'm glad I met this man, and in that moment, I was glad for the terrible traffic of Los Angeles.
And with that, thanks, Alex. With that, I would like to introduce our guest for today's episode, Noah Rasheta. Noah, welcome to The Switch.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here with you guys, and thank you for sharing that story, Alex. That was awesome.
Thanks.
Yeah. So,
and I learned that quote from you, so secondhand from the Dalai Lama.
Before we get into the main topic for today, Noah, I just want to get some background on you and sort of spend some time letting you tell your story leading up to where you are now, and use that as a way to help get us into this topic. So, where did you come from? Where did you start? And what was your childhood like, especially with an eye toward religion and spirituality, but experiences in general?
So I grew up in Texas until my early teens, and then moved to Mexico, where my mom is from, and spent 9 years living in Mexico. So I kind of grew up with a dual culture, dual languages, and in some ways dual religions, because when I was really young, my parents converted to Mormonism. So I grew up in the LDS faith, and then living in Mexico, I was heavily influenced by Catholicism because I went to private Catholic schools. All of my aunts and uncles and my grandparents, all the family in Mexico is very Catholic. So I kind of grew up with the duality of the languages, the culture, and then of course the ideologies and the doctrines of the two religions. So that's kind of my background. In school, I was always fascinated with philosophy, and history was my favorite subject. So I was fascinated with the stories about our past, who did what and when and where, and then combining that with philosophy and the ideas. Where do some ideas come from and how do they get started? So I kind of always had that in the back of my mind, but I grew up with a pretty certain idea that what I believed and what I had was absolutely true and didn't need to be questioned or explored much. So with that mindset, I felt very secure in my way of thinking and in life in general. I knew where I came from, why I was here, where I was going when I died. I had a lot of certainty. Went into that. With that certainty, went into the new stage of life, being married, having kids, and entering all these stages with all the answers. But about 4 years into my marriage, I went through a really rocky stage and started questioning my ability to discern whether or not I was in a healthy relationship, whether or not I could read people, specifically my spouse. Like, does she really want to stay married to me? It's a concept I hadn't thought about much because, like I said, I've always just had a lot of certainty. So anyway, we go through this ordeal, this really rough patch, and I start questioning things like, man, how would I know if she really wants to be with me or if she doesn't? Like, how would I really know that? How do you judge someone and really know these things? Because like I said, up until that point, I felt like I knew a lot.
Yeah.
So that form of questioning transitioned into, well, what if there are other certainties in my life that aren't so certain? And I want to say about roughly 6 months after this period of questioning started, it transitioned from questioning my marriage and questioning somebody that I felt really close to questioning my beliefs. Like, man, I've always felt a lot of comfort in my beliefs, but what if I'm wrong about those too? How do I really know? Like, I've been able to say for most of my life, I know this and I know that. But suddenly I was faced with, how do I know that I know?
Yeah.
And so then I started remembering a lot of the things that I had learned in high school and in philosophy and in religion class. And I wanted to have that sense of certainty again. So I kind of I started a quest looking for answers. And the search for answers led me down several rabbit holes, studying, first starting with my own religion and studying the history of Mormonism, the deeper ideologies and doctrines of Mormonism. And that felt like a rabbit hole that was opening more cans of worms. It was giving me more questions than it was answers. Kind of took a step back further in time and started exploring early Christianity and the historicity of how the Bible was written, the New Testament. And again, I encountered the same problems. It was giving me more answers, or it was giving me more questions than it was giving me answers. And then somewhere along that path, I listened to a world religions seminar that was like the meaning of life as explained by the 5 major world religions. And it kind of went through Christianity and Islam and Judaism and Hinduism. And the 5th and final topic was on Buddhism, which at the time I knew very little about. I think my only experience with it was quotes that you'd hear here and there from people like the Dalai Lama that you're like, oh, that's a really cool quote.
Yeah.
And I often wondered, like, what makes somebody think that way? So that was about the extent of my knowledge. But during this lecture series, something really interesting happened, because up until then, I was getting a lot of answers. Here's the answer to where you were. Here's the answer to why you're here. Here's the answer about what happens when you die, but through different lenses. According to these guys, it's this. According to these other guys, it's that. But the lecturer said something really fascinating when he got to the topic on Buddhism. And he said, just so you know, the Buddhist tradition doesn't typically have answers for any of these questions. They turn it around and try to get to the question come from. And that was like a radical shift for me. I paused and I was like, yeah, why do I want to know? And I thought it was fascinating that they didn't have an answer, that their answer to it was keep digging with the question, find the source of the question, then you don't need the answer. And I think I was hooked from that moment. I was like, well, I never explored that way. I've explored all the other ways, right? Looking for the answers, but I had never spent time trying to understand the questions. And that started my journey with studying Buddhism and trying to get more introspective to understand the source of my questions. And I think in a way I was thinking to myself, well, if I didn't have the question, then the answers wouldn't bother me anymore. They would be irrelevant. And that's kind of what happened over time. The more and more I studied it, the more I understood the source of my questions, why I wanted certainty. And before I knew it, the question of having answers and having certainty kind of went away. And it was a really interesting shift for me in my mindset when I realized I was no longer on the search for answers. I was only on the quest for understanding my questions and understanding why these things matter to me. And ironically, the search for the answers, not finding the answers, ultimately led to much more peace and contentment in my marriage. It kind of healed that relationship and the uncertainty that there was there. It healed in a lot of ways the existential angst I was feeling about my beliefs and my religion. What I started to find was just a lot of peace. So that's kind of what led me to here throughout that whole journey. That was almost 8 years of searching. And towards the end of it, I kind of formalized my practice and study with Buddhism even more. I did a 2-year lay ministry program and graduated from that as a lay minister. But what I found at the end of all of it was peace and contentment. I didn't find any answers. Unfortunately, I still don't have any of them. But the questions don't bother me. I don't know that any of the existential questions, they're just irrelevant to me. It's not like they're in the back of my head wishing that maybe one day I'll find it. It's like they've really just kind of gone away to the background and they're just there.
Yeah.
And that's kind of my journey in a nutshell.
Did you know any Buddhists before you had this experience with sort of your connection to Buddhism? Did you know anybody who was a practicing Buddhist or anything like that?
No, I didn't. Growing up, we had some neighbors who were from, can't remember if they were from Taiwan or from mainland China. And they were Buddhists. I remember they had like Buddha statues in their home, but I didn't know what any of that meant.
Yeah.
I was young, their kids were my age, so we just interacted as kids. And I don't remember any discussions at all regarding Buddhism. So yeah, I would say probably nothing. That was about the extent of my knowledge of Buddhism, other than associating it to robes and meditation. I knew that meditation was a part of it, but I didn't really know what that meant either.
And what about meditation in other parts of culture, sort of separate from Buddhism? Had you heard about people meditating? Like I know before I heard anything about Buddhism, like I knew about sort of the New Age meditation people, and I sort of associated that all in one big group with the same people who were looking at healing crystals and psychedelics and like all this other stuff that I just sort of lumped together. Did you have any knowledge or conception of meditation outside of the context of Buddhism?
No, I think similar to you, I just knew it was this thing, and some people who practiced it had other strange ideas that I didn't really resonate with me. But I did know, because by then it had kind of popularized in mainstream culture. I knew it was one of those things that is supposed to bring you peace and calm. And that was a big part of my discovery or my interest in Buddhism in the first place was, so when I'm going through this really rough patch, I was looking for something to help me feel more calm because I felt like I was going crazy in my head. So I did seek out meditation. Like I Googled it and I researched what is meditation, how do you do it, why does it work? And in that query, I found the link to meditation and Buddhism and realized, oh, okay, that's where it comes from. And that piqued my interest in Buddhism. I wanted to know, where does this stuff come from? Why does it work? How does it work? So yeah, all of it kind of played in, but I didn't have any experience with it before. I think the extent of my knowledge with it was, oh, you sit there and you stop all your thinking or something along those lines.
Yeah. Yeah.
How I discovered it in a very vulnerable place too. I was, just super anxious in college, and I was just looking anywhere desperately for an end to that anxiety and suffering. And I guess I would just say I got lucky. I just picked up the right book that connected with me. So I wanted to ask you do you think it helps to be in a vulnerable position to learn from Buddhism? Because a lot of the people I've talked to, like you just said, are really searching for an answer. And people who might not be on that search or in a vulnerable position, they might not be open to it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I've noticed the same thing. It seems like when everything is going your way, you don't necessarily have the urge for things to be other than how they are. In that stage of contentment, people aren't really longing. They're not looking for another way. So I think you're right. It is very common that when suddenly out of the blue, life is no longer conforming to your expectation of it, that's when you think, well, wait a second, something's wrong. And you start looking for what's wrong? What did I do? How do I fix this? And that's usually connected with some instance of discomfort or suffering. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think that's when you're in the right mindset to start looking for it. Prior to that, there's no need.
Yeah.
What was your experience like the first time you meditated?
I'm trying to remember the first time I meditated. I think so. I don't know if it was the first time, but definitely one of the first times. I remember sitting down thinking that the whole key to this was time. Like, I set a timer and I set a goal. Like, I'm going to sit here for an hour or something like that. And I think I remember looking down and realizing, like, what seemed like an hour when I looked down had only been 15 minutes or something, and thinking, how on earth could I ever get to an hour? That's just not possible. And then that made it so that the time slowed down even more. Then I'd give it another big chunk and look down, and now I'm only at 18. How was that possible? And I do remember feeling frustrated that I was never going to master this secret art of meditation because I couldn't sit for very long. My mind was really busy, and I do remember thinking, and this isn't for me. This is going to be one of those things that I'll just never do. I'll try it, but I'll probably never really spend much time with it. I do remember that in my early experiences with meditation.
And so now that you've gone through this lay ministry program, you are a Buddhist minister. Is that the correct term for that?
Yeah, it is technically. I mean,
okay.
So the differentiation between a lay minister and, say, a monk or something is typically someone who's taken monastic vows will wear a robe, and in those vows, depending on their tradition, there may be vows of celibacy or things of that nature. But in the Japanese tradition and in the Zen schools of Buddhism, it's very common for the brothers or priests to be married and to not be monks. In other words, they're not necessarily out there wearing robes. They haven't removed themselves from society or anything like that. Yeah. And that's the form of Buddhism that I studied with and practiced. So it is a minister, but they say lay minister just to differentiate the monastic society.
Okay. Yeah. I was going to ask, so when you are teaching to people, especially, beginners who may be in that vulnerable space that we were talking about, or who may be, trying meditation for the first time, or you're introducing them to new bits and pieces of this philosophy, first of all, what experience do you see people have, and what's sort of the most common advice you give to people who are, experiencing whatever they're experiencing for the first time?
So typically the first thing that I notice with someone who's learning these concepts and going through some kind of difficult emotion is very similar to what I was experiencing, which is there's the experience itself, just the raw feeling of whatever you're going through, but then there's the feeling you have about that feeling. In other words, you can be sitting with a strong emotion like anger or anxiety, and then you have a feeling about that. In other words, I don't like that feeling. I either feel positive or negative or neutral about that emotion. And for a lot of these feelings like anxiety and anger, we have a negative feeling about them. So when we're experiencing the emotion, we don't want to experience the emotion, or we get angry that we're experiencing the emotion. So it starts to layer on itself because now I'm mad that I'm mad. So, which is exactly what I was experiencing. And the first thing that I notice when people realize that the whole point of meditation is to learn to just be with that experience, whatever it is, like the first layer of emotion, I see a huge sense of liberation. It's like, oh, wait, you're saying it's okay to be mad? And it's like, yeah, be mad. If you're going to be mad, be mad. Sit with that anger, study it, look at it, feel it, really feel it. And I often see a sense of liberation, like, okay, I have permission to be mad. I'm going to just be mad. And many of us, including myself, realize that what was making anger such a strong emotion was the secondary emotion, the anger about the anger. That was definitely the case with me. And it lasted years before I finally figured out it was okay to be angry. And ironically, it's by allowing yourself to finally just be with that base emotion that it'll eventually pass, because that's the nature of emotions. So that's the advice I give most often to someone who's new and they're entering this practice from some place of discomfort. It's to sit with your discomfort and have total permission to feel whatever you're feeling, whether that be anger or hatred or resentment of some sort, whatever it is, it's okay. Like, the thought that I shouldn't be feeling this or thinking this aggravates the problem. And I always find people are very surprised to learn that. It seems like such a common sense thing. But I think from societal conditioning or something, we don't naturally think that. That was the case with me too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think that's actually a great segue into the next big conversation topic. What is Buddhism?
Yeah, that's a very, very big question. And I would answer it like this. Buddhism has become the study of, or let me reword this. So whatever the Buddha practiced has turned into the teachings about what the Buddha practiced. And for a lot of people, that's Buddhism. It's the study of what the Buddha taught and what the Buddha did. But the original practice, if you were to just distill Buddhism down to its most basic thing, is it's the art of becoming mindful and aware of the direct experience you're having in the present moment, without any judgment, without any feelings of aversion towards some feelings and emotions, or clinging or desire towards experiencing more of this other emotion. So in some traditions, this has evolved in Buddhism to calling it mindfulness or calling it Zen, because every time you sit with the definition long enough, it becomes troublesome. Mm. So it's a hard thing to define, but I think Buddhism as a practice it's trying to take all the teachings and practices that stem from the original teacher, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, and that's it. It's not more than that. But like I said, with any ancient tradition, the teachings become the teachings about the teachings, and things start to get a little bit more complicated there.
Yeah. If you could describe some of the sort of core teachings, I mean, I know, you said mindfulness, and are there more specific core teachings, or are any of the other sort of details particular to different sects, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, there are some specific teachings that are kind of the universal core teachings of Buddhism. And those are essentially the teachings of the three marks of existence, which is that in life, there are difficulties. In life, what we observe is that all things are impermanent, so constant change. And the third one of those is that all things are interdependent, meaning what makes one thing is always affected by everything else. And that's easy to visualize in something like a flower. What makes the flower a flower is that there's the sun and the rain and clouds and all the things that go into allowing a flower to be a flower, makes the flower interdependent with all these non-flower elements. So those are the three marks of existence, that there's suffering in life, suffering arises, impermanence and interdependence. Now, beyond those three marks of existence, then there's the core teachings of pretty much any school of Buddhism is the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. And in some schools, these are taught as tasks rather than like empirical truths that are either true or not, more as statements of observation. And those four are the truth of the nature of suffering, which is that, when life when we want things to be other than how they are, we experience discomfort, we experience anguish or suffering. Suffering is the most common word used there, but it can be translated to other words like anguish and discomfort. So that's the first truth, is that discomfort is there. We all experience it in life. The second is the source of that discomfort is craving. It's wanting things to be other than they are. So we understand that suffering is there. We understand that there are causes for it. Those are the first two. And then the third one is we understand that we can address the causes of suffering. And the fourth one is that we can follow a path or live a lifestyle that minimizes or eases the discomfort. So those are essentially the Four Noble Truths, and they're kind of explained in different ways based on which specific school of Buddhism, but they are pretty universal. And inside of that fourth Noble Truth, or that fourth overall topic, is that there's a path that you can live that minimizes that suffering. And that's what's known as the Eightfold Path. And it's kind of the 8 areas in life that you can focus on or work with to minimize that discomfort or suffering that arises in life. I would say those three, the 3 marks of existence, the 4 noble truths, and the Eightfold Path are probably the 3 most universal teachings or the core ideas that are found pretty unanimously across all the schools of Buddhism.
So it sounds to me like this is much more sort of a observational. It sounds like it's a very descriptive way of talking about things rather than, well, maybe not as opposed to prescriptive. I guess the contrast I'm trying to make is with typical, what Westerners would typically think of as religion. It sounds different. How do you think that Buddhism compares to Western religion, and is it, I've heard it talked about as being compatible with Western, theism or atheism, that it's sort of separate in that context? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And what I would say is that it is and it isn't. And I'll kind of elaborate on each one. The reason that it is because, like I mentioned earlier, most ideologies or religions are focused on giving us answers to life's great questions. So they're not necessarily compatible with each other, because the answer you get in one place may be different than the answer you get in another place. So there's a sense of competition, which one is right. And then Buddhism comes in kind of in a unique position where it can be practiced as a religion. Some would say it's more of a philosophy or a way of life that's introspective, and it's about the questions. So in that sense, it can be compatible with an ideology that's focused on answers, and then you have an ideology that's focused on the questions, because they're not really competing. One gives you what you're looking for on this end of the spectrum, and the other one is on the other end of the spectrum, right? The questions versus answers don't necessarily compete. So in that sense, I think it can be very compatible, and it is common to find Christians who practice meditation. In Europe, in some of the monasteries there, it's very common to find Christian monastics who practice meditation with Buddhist monastics, because again, they can be compatible. One is strengthening certain parts of the practice, like mindfulness and focus and understanding yourself, and the other practice is kind of focusing externally on your relationship to a greater power or a deity. So in that sense, they can definitely be compatible. I think some of the areas where you run into incompatibilities between these overall paths would be in how they're practiced, where one is teaching you to look inward and the other one is teaching you to look outward. For example, in several religions, the overall dilemma of life is that the state that you find yourself in is a fallen state, and you cannot recover from that state without the help of an external agent, right? Like the salvation that comes from Jesus, or putting your faith in God, something along those lines. And Buddhism comes along and kind of presents it from a different light that says you're not in a fallen state. You're in the original state is a state of kindness and compassion, essentially a good state. And what muddies it are ideas and beliefs and concepts that prevent you from seeing that or knowing that about yourself. But you cannot arrive at that state through an external agent. It can only happen looking inward and discovering for yourself, your true nature of being kind and compassionate, or so forth. So in that sense, as a practice, it can seem contradictory of sorts, because one's saying you're not going to be okay till you put all your faith in this external thing, and the other one's saying you're going to keep being a jerk until you look inward and realize why you're a jerk. So you know what I mean? Yeah. So I don't think they necessarily have to be incompatible, but they can seem at times incompatible. But I find it's more common to find people who find the compatibility working between Buddhism and any other one.
And there seems to be a lot of variety with the degrees to which people practice Buddhism too, right? Like a lot of Western people may just do the meditation, maybe just a core mindfulness meditation, and they don't know anything about the Eightfold Path or the Four Noble Truths. So it seems like I suppose the same is true of something like any of the other religions. There's varying degrees of how much people ascribe to them. But I wanted to ask about one of the cores of Buddhism that you mentioned being inherent in most of the practice of it, which is all life is suffering. Because I know when I first came to be reading about Buddhism and stuff like that, and something that seems to turn people off, I've noticed, is that idea that all life is suffering. So what does that mean, and why isn't it a bad thing?
Yeah, you bring up a good point, and I think it's a common interpretation of that teaching is that life is suffering, but the actual teaching is more along the lines of in life there is suffering. And so rather than saying, hey, life is a crappy thing, it's saying in life, crappy things happen. And everybody, and it's universal. Everybody knows what this feels like. The degree or the extent of the crappiness may vary, But we all know the feeling. The feeling is I'm stuck at a red light and I don't want to be stuck at a red light. That not wanting it to be that way, that's the feeling. It may be, working with a family member who's sick, who has cancer. It's the same feeling. So like I said, the degree and the intensity may vary, but the feeling that some things, sometimes in life isn't the way I want it to be, that is a universal thing. That's what Buddhism is trying to teach with that teaching, is that feeling. Everybody knows what that feels like. Either they do in this moment, or they will at some future moment, because that's one of the natures of reality, is that difficulties arise in life. There are difficulties. But I think that conveys a whole different image in your head if you hear it worded as life is suffering, because it's not always suffering. Sometimes life is incredible. There are these moments where you're not feeling that and you're very content with how life is. So that's the distinction, I think, between the two. At one end, you think life is always that. That's not true. That's not accurate. Everybody knows that, because there are days that you don't feel that way. But everybody knows that there are days and moments when you do feel that. That's what Buddhism is emphasizing in that teaching.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I think that's a place where, in my own life, I've seen a big crossover between Buddhism and Stoicism. I'm curious, Noah, have you ever studied any of the Stoics?
I read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, I want to say in high school.
Yeah.
And I've since come across more Stoic teachings and quotes and found a lot of compatibility with Buddhist thinking and Buddhist quotes.
Yeah.
But I haven't necessarily studied it in detail anytime in my recent years.
Yeah. So the compatibility that I think is apt in this topic, in Stoicism, there's this idea of the dichotomy of control, where you can sort of categorize things that happen in life as either things that are completely under your control or things that are not under your control. And the Stoic injunction, I guess, is that the things that are not under your control, it's sort of your duty to accept that those things are part of life. Those are the things that happen, and any sort of prolonged mental suffering from the things that are not under your control is just sort of your own failure to accept those things. And then for the things that are under your control, the injunction is to act as wisely as possible. Do things that are the most ethical with the actions that you can take. Understanding that your actions affect things around you, understanding that whatever system of ethics you may subscribe to, you have a duty to act ethically moment to moment. But this whole idea of life being suffering, or life having these components that you can either react in a way that is attached or non-attached, I think is very similar to this dichotomy of control aspect of Stoicism.
Yeah, that sounds very compatible.
Yeah.
I'll have to read more books on Stoicism.
I definitely recommend Seneca. He's an interesting guy, and I think a little more absorbable than Marcus Aurelius, although Marcus Aurelius is very quotable. Okay, so one of the other terms that I hear a lot is non-attachment. And I wonder if you could explain that, and then I have a question about non-attachment that was a little silly, but it came up in conversation a couple weeks ago. But yeah, so could you explain the idea of non-attachment?
Yeah. Something that I think is important to clarify with the concept of non-attachment is it's essentially a form of neutrality in relationship to the things we would typically be attached to. I think the misconception with the teaching of non-attachment is that it's synonymous with detachment. In other words, the opposite of attachment is, like detachment. And non-attachment is a little bit more neutral. It implies there can be attachment, but it's not permanent. So with that said, my favorite way of explaining something like non-attachment is like the love that somebody has for their children, right? When they're growing and they're young, like you're really heavily involved with what they do and taking them around and and making certain decisions for them that you know are best for them. But as they continue to grow and age, at some point there's this moment where you kind of have to let them go. You let them go do their thing. And it takes a lot of love to do that. I mean, that comes from a place of love when you're capable of saying, okay, now you're on your own. And the idea of non-attachment, I think, can be seen as a visual in that transition of, you're under my house, these are my rules, you do this because this is how I do it. But one day I realize now you're on your own and you get to figure it all out. You still love them, and that's a very non-attached form of love. So that's essentially the teaching of non-attachment, is that throughout our day-to-day lives, we have an attachment to the way that we are, the labels that we use for ourselves, whether these be like, the descriptions of what I do in a career, for example. I can be attached to these labels, meaning I never want to not be that, right? Or the non-attached approach would be the understanding of, this is what I am right now, but I haven't always been this, and I may not always be this. But that doesn't mean that in this present moment, I shouldn't be this, right? That's detachment, is the sense of I shouldn't be anything. Non-attachment is saying, I can be whatever I am, knowing that may change, because the nature of reality is constant change. So that's something I like to highlight with this concept of non-attachment. Then looking, what are the things that really matter to me in my life, and am I attached to them, or do I practice a sense of non-attachment, meaning I can still do this, but I know that I may not always do this. And I think it gets really powerful when you apply that to things like ideas and opinions, right? I think a big misconception is non-attachment means I shouldn't have ideas, I shouldn't have beliefs, I shouldn't have opinions. And that's just not true. Non-attachment means, sure, I have an opinion and an idea or a belief, but I know that if that ever changes, fine, it changes. And now I've got this new opinion because I'm non-attached to my opinions. I let them change and evolve because life changes and evolves. So does that kind of clarify non-attachment?
Yeah, I think so. And my question, you actually started by pretty much answering my question, which was basically how can you have something like an intimate relationship or loving relationship with someone and remain non-attached? Doesn't a relationship like that necessitate some form of attachment?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's a common concern when people learn about this concept of non-attachment, specifically to relationships. And what I like to say is the idea of non-attachment in a relationship doesn't necessarily have to do with the person. It has to do with the permanent aspect of that person. So we all know, anyone who's been in a relationship or is in a relationship, that the person that we started out the relationship with is not the same person in the present moment of the relationship, right? Whether it be a year into your marriage or something, or 10 years into it. Everybody knows that this is not the same person. So that sense of attachment would be me thinking like, I got duped because the person that I married is not the same person today than when I married them. That's a sense of attachment. I'm attached to who they were, and I think they should always be that way, because the nature of reality is constant change. So the non-attached version of that relationship is recognizing that they're always changing, I'm always changing, and what I'm working towards in that relationship is to be the best and most compatible version of me now that works with the best and most compatible version of who they are now, and evolving, constantly changing and evolving in that relationship. It's almost like a non-attached relationship is learning to fall in love over and over and over and over. And the attached version of a relationship is saying, well, you're not who I fell in love with, so now I don't want to be with you anymore.
Why do you think we get so attached to things like certain concepts or ideas about permanence in the world?
That's a good question. I think a big part of it is our tendency to see permanence where there is no. And this has to do, going back to our emotions, right? As soon as I experience an emotion that I like, I attach to that. I like this. I want more of this. or when I experience an emotion I don't like, something that's unpleasant, I don't ever want to feel that again. And this sense of permanence grows right there. I never want that. I'll always want this. And the nature of reality is that things are changing. One day I'll feel this, one day I'll feel that. And I think that longing for things to always feel good or never feel bad extends into this unhealthy way of seeing reality. If I like my partner the way they were when I met them, I want to make sure they never change, because I don't ever want to lose that feeling I had when I realized I really liked them. So in some ways, it's like we bring this misery on ourselves by trying to see permanence where there is no permanence. But I think it extends to a lot of aspects of our lives to want to have some sense of permanence.
And I think also if there is a permanence, we feel like we have more understanding. If we can say, okay, that's that, I understand it, I can move on. Like I remember in high school, I had a relationship, and one or both of us would say, like, I hope you never change, and that's such a unrealistic statement and an unhealthy principle to set out in a relationship. But I think it was because of being scared of change and thinking that this is a positive way of being, and it might not be if something changes.
Yeah, it's funny, that statement, I hope you never change.
Yeah.
I think we do this with ourselves. This is why you see, people spend so much money and effort on not changing how they look. I like the way I looked in college, and I want to make sure I always look that way, and I'm going to do surgeries or whatever it takes to try to look young, because I cannot accept the fact that with time I will look old. It's a variation of the same symptom. It's wanting there to be permanence where there is no permanence.
Yeah.
I feel like we could come up with examples all day of where modern popular culture sort of cultivates that understanding of reality, of wanting things to be permanent and never having to grow old or never having to have things change.
Yeah.
It's funny.
In fact, that was one of the things that I connected with the guy I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. Was there was this culture of wanting things to be materialistically permanent, and just seeing kind of through that. And I feel like through Buddhism, I was able to see that, just accept, it's unfortunate probably that a lot of people act as if this were true, because it's not beneficial for their mental health, maybe. And when he saw it, it angered him. So I think that was what I was trying to get across to him, was that you can see these truths and learn to accept them, and find peace in that, with the world not being perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that reminds me of another sort of parallel with Stoicism. And, the Stoics talk about death a lot, but, they say that something like death is a part of life. So if you have a plant that you like and the plant dies, if you are upset by that, it's actually not the death of the plant itself that is upsetting or bad. It's your perception of it. It's your conception of what happened. And the Stoics would say something like, well, it's sort of your own fault that you're upset about your plant dying, and it's up to you next time to accept that if you're going to own a plant, death is part of life, and that's something you have to accept. But there's another parallel that's part of that, which is, in general, things that are good or bad, it's not the things themselves that are good or bad, it's your conception of them. It's how you are characterizing those things in your mind as they happen or after they happen that makes them good or bad. Is there how would you explain the sort of Buddhist version or conception of things being good or bad in that sense?
Yeah, I like that you bring that up, that It's not necessarily the circumstances themselves that are good or bad, but how we view those. An example I use often is I'll ask somebody, is it a good thing or a bad thing to be driving and get a flat tire? And most people will say very quickly it's a bad thing. Nobody wants to get a flat tire. And then I'll say, well, what if you were in the prison bus on your way to where you're going to be executed? Now what? Do you want that flat tire? And they're like, oh, yeah, well, in that case, I would want the flat tire. So again, highlights the fact that, well, then the flat tire isn't the problem, is it?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the things that we go through in life, as we go through them, we put meaning on it. This is a good thing. This is a bad thing. And there's a parable that I share often, which is a Taoist parable, but it works really well with the Buddhist understanding of good and bad as not being absolutes. Because again, if things are impermanent, then how could there always be something that's good or be something that's always bad? And that's exactly what this parable highlights. And the parable of the horse, if you don't mind me sharing it.
I was actually going to ask you to. That's the one that I was thinking of sharing at the beginning, but I'm glad it came up in this way. Yeah, go for it.
Good. It's one of my favorites because it really hits home this message that of good and bad. Who's to say what's good and bad? And the parable goes that there was an old man in the field, and out of the blue, a horse shows up, and his neighbor comes running over and says, "Hey, how fortunate for you! You got a horse." And he replies with, "Who knows what's fortunate or what luck is," or in some versions of the story, it's who knows what is good and what is bad. And he goes about doing his thing. And then later that day, the horse runs away, and the neighbor comes running over, and he's like, "Oh no, how unfortunate for you that your horse ran away." And again, he's like, who's to say what's good and what's bad, and goes about doing his thing. And the horse comes back with 4 additional horses, and the neighbor comes running over. He's like, "Oh man, you're so lucky. Now you've got 5 horses. This is great." He's like, "Well, who's to say what's good and what's bad?" Goes about doing his thing. And then his son's out there trying to tame one of the horses to use it in the field, and he falls and breaks his leg. And the neighbor comes running over, and he's all upset. "How bad for you. Your son has a broken leg. He's your only helper." And the old man says, "Who's to say what's good and bad?" and goes about doing his thing. And the next day, the army comes into town, and they're conscripting the youth, and they can't take his son because his leg is broken. And the neighbor comes running over. He's like, "You're so lucky. Your son broke his leg yesterday." And then he pauses. He's like, "Well, who's to say what's good and what's bad?" and turns around and walks home. And that, in a nutshell, is the Buddhist understanding of good things and bad things, in the sense, not that there are no good things and there are no bad things, but in the sense of permanence. Again, we want to highlight permanence here. Is what seemed good one day turns into the very source of your discontent the next day, or what seemed like the source of your discontent one day turns around and seems like the very source of your joy the next day. And that's what the story or the parable is trying to highlight, is because of the nature of things being impermanent or constant change, who's to say that this bad thing is always going to be bad? It may be the very thing that one day you realize, well, man, this other good thing wouldn't have happened if that bad thing hadn't happened. And I think if we're being honest with ourselves, a lot of us, even now, at whatever stage you're at in life, you can pause and look back and see this. You can see this in your own life, moments of the breakup with one, the person you thought was your soulmate. Later on, you're like, well, geez, had that not happened, I wouldn't be with this person. But also what seemed like the start of, the happiest day of my life, I married my soulmate, also turns into the disaster of my life because now I'm going through this divorce, right? Like you see this in your own life in so many aspects. Who's to say what's good and what's bad?
Yeah, it's beautiful. I love that story. I found the Marcus Aurelius quote. He says, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. And this you have the power to revoke at any moment." So there's the Stoicism for you. Does Buddhism in general have anything to say about sort of the moral component of good and bad, sort of good versus evil?
Yeah, it does, but it's not in the sense of, again, there being like an absolute source of good and evil. what it tries to teach in terms of good and evil is that the source of good things and the source of bad things or harmful things, it's internal. It starts with you. So rather than seeing me as this independent entity in this permanent world, and there are external agents acting upon me like good and evil, Buddhism is saying you are an interdependent entity in an interdependent world, and the source of good and nice things or evil and harmful things starts in you. You're the one who is the source of it all. And this is something that's echoed in the actual story of the Buddha. Like the historical account of the Buddha is that he went out and he was experiencing discontent with how things are in life, and specifically concerning sickness, old age, and death. These things really bothered him. How do we get past this? And anyway, he starts this journey to try to figure life out, to try to find the source of it all. And he studies with this teacher, and then he goes to that teacher, and ultimately his journey turned inward. And at that moment of turning inward and studying himself, what he found was that he was the source of it all. And I think that's what Buddhism tries to echo today in its teachings, is that you are the source of it all. Sure, there are evil things that happen in the world, evil acts that people do, but there's not an external agent that influenced that. Like that's humanity's scapegoat, right? The devil made me do it. Why don't we do the same when we do something nice? Hey, you were really nice to your neighbor today. Oh, God made me do it. It wasn't me, But for the evil, sure, we'll blame that on the devil. But so rather than looking for these external agents that we can rely on that are the source of goodness or badness in life, Buddhism teaches that the good and evil is inside you, and it's not like this absolute force. It's there's a source of it. So this becomes really pragmatic and practical as an approach, because I can realize, hey, if I'm doing these harmful things, let's say as a father or as a husband, I'm a crappy one, rather than just saying, oh yeah, because some evil external thing causes this on me, I can actually sit and say, I could be a more skillful father if I learned, why am I doing these things? Why do I say the things that I say or think the things that I think? And what I would find at the end of that exploration is that it's internal, that I am the source of it all. And that's something I really like about Buddhism, that I try to echo often in Buddhist teachings, is that Buddhism invites you to look inward and to find the source of goodness or the source of evil or badness in yourself. Because that's something that we can all do, find that about ourselves. So that's how Buddhism kind of approaches that topic of good and evil.
Mm-hmm. Also in Buddhism is the idea of enlightenment. And I've heard you describe enlightenment in a little bit more of a kind of like what you were just talking about, like less black and white terms. So what is enlightenment in traditional Buddhist idea of it, and how would you describe it in your interpretation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think enlightenment is one of those really problematic words because it means something different to everyone. So does goodness, right? If I were to say, what makes a good person good, that answer may be different in one culture or in one ideology versus another culture and another ideology. This is why you can have, from one perspective, a suicide bomber is a good and faithful person, and through another perspective is a horrible, evil person. Enlightenment is similar because it's a concept. Whatever it is what it is, but then we have a concept of what it is, and that becomes really problematic because some people will say their concept of it means this and it means that. Based on each school or tradition of Buddhism, you run into this too. But many, if not most, maybe, I wouldn't say all, but probably most schools of Buddhism will acknowledge the problematic part of enlightenment is the definition of enlightenment. So if we look at this word, what does it mean to be enlightened? And the example, well, who's enlightened? In Buddhism, it's the Buddha became enlightened. What is it that the Buddha did? What made him enlightened? Because If you study the story of the Buddha, once he became enlightened, which was early on in his career, so to speak, in his 30s, and then he went on to live till his 80s. So what happened in that second stage of life once he was enlightened? Well, by no accounts are you finding out that, oh, there's this superhero and he can fly, or there's nothing magical happening. Suddenly you just have this teacher who's out there teaching. What makes him enlightened then? And I think, in my interpretation of what Buddhism teaches, is that it can be found in that transition of having looked for the external agent acting on him in all things, to this looking inward and finding that he himself was the source of it all. I think it's, in some ways, it's that simple, that transition to, I can't blame my actions and behaviors on someone else anymore. It's all on me, and I need to understand me. And even within that, there may be aspects of that I can't control, right? Like if I have schizophrenia or something like that. But the more we understand, the more we see these are internal things that are happening. So I think I would answer kind of both of those questions, how I view it and how I think Buddhism views it, along the same lines, that it's the transition, the switch that goes off of you looking outside of yourself for things like happiness or things like peace, to you turning and realizing, I don't need to look outside of myself anymore. It's all in here, whether that be my peace and contentment and joy, or my orneriness and my being mean and hitting people or something.
Yeah.
It's both of those turn inward, and that's the start of what it means to be enlightened.
So I do want to make sure we're keeping track of time. I have 2.5 more questions before we move on. So first, what is the main benefit of the practice of meditation? I mean, we've been talking philosophy a lot, but a big thing in Buddhism is this practice of meditation. What's the main benefit of the practice of meditation? And is meditation something that could benefit everyone? Like, why isn't everyone doing this?
Okay. Yeah, 2 very good questions. So the first one, what is the practical or the beneficial part of meditation? I would say our general tendency as we go through life is that we are habitually reactive, and we're hardwired for this. From an evolutionary standpoint, our brains are hardwired to take all the cognitive shortcuts possible to do the most that we can with the least amount of computing power possible. And this is why you can read books on psychology or Google cognitive biases, and there's this entire list of what our brain kind of tends to do with our biases. Understanding that about ourselves, what we'd realize is, through a lot of the things that we go through in life, we're just reactive, unintentionally reactive. This happens and I react, right? This thought arises and this emotion is my reaction to the thought. Or the emotion may trigger a memory. The memory may trigger another thought or another emotion, and it's reactive. Like, I'm not even controlling it. That's just what happens. And that form of going through life in a very reactive way, just reacting to whatever thought popped up or whatever craving arose, or external things like, you say this to me, well, I react this way to you. Like, not a lot of thought goes into that. We're just going through life in this reactive mode. Mindfulness or Buddhism as a practice kind of steps in and says, that may not be the most skillful way to go through life. And not that it's bad, not that it's wrong. Like, sure, you can go through life that way, but maybe there's a more skillful way. And that is a way where you can occasionally have gaps and pauses, and you can see this reactivity, and you can see the stopping of the reactivity. And that allows there to be moments where you can actually be more skillful with what you do next, how you react. Not just, again, that's not just reacting to these external things, it's reacting to the internal things. Oh, there's this reoccurring thought, that I deal with that makes me feel, where's my self-esteem or something along those lines. That's also a form of reactivity. So this is a much more mindful approach to how we can put pauses and cease the habitual reactivity. So I would say that's kind of the answer to the first question. That's why meditation can be very practical for anyone who wants to break out of that cycle of habitual reactivity. And that kind of dovetails with the second question of which was, why should everyone practice it? Was that how you framed that?
Well, yeah. Would it be beneficial for everyone? And if so, why isn't everyone doing it?
Okay, yeah. So I think it could certainly be beneficial to anyone, but it's especially beneficial to the people who are no longer wanting to feel that. Again, an example I draw often here is, it's like the hamster on the hamster wheel, right? There's nothing wrong with a hamster being on a hamster wheel. That's what hamsters do. But if the hamster reaches this point where it becomes exhausted and it's like, I'm never going to get to where I'm trying to get to, it may be skillful for that hamster to realize, oh, I don't have to be on this hamster wheel. I can jump off. I think that correlates a little bit with our day-to-day lives. Like, we can go through life being reactive. That's what we've evolved to do. But at some point, and sometimes it's through, a case of suffering, some intense thing happens in your life that causes you to pause and say, do I really want to keep going this way? And it's often in those instances where many of us decide, I don't want it to be like this anymore, and we start to look for another way. Those are the people who this is really, really beneficial for. So it sounds almost like a joke to say it, but it's like mindfulness is for people who want to be mindful. It's not for people who don't want to be mindful. Yeah. And I associate this sometimes to another practice of mine, which is paragliding. I love to go paragliding and spend time in the air. And people will say, hey, it seems to be this thing that brings you a lot of joy and contentment in life. Should I look into it? And I'll always say, that's not my call. You may be afraid of heights, in which case I would say, definitely don't do this. Why would you ever want to do it? And I think mindfulness is similar. With some people, I would probably say, why do you want to sit and meditate? People who will tell me I'm extremely agitated and I can't stand sitting. Should I meditate? I'm like, no. Why on earth would you do that? So it sounds kind of funny again to say it that way, but mindfulness is for people who want to be more mindful, for people who want more peace in their life. In the same way that paragliding is for people who want to spend more time up in the air. It's not for everyone. And I don't think it's fair to say that mindfulness is something everyone should be doing. Do I think it could benefit anyone who does it? Absolutely. Do I think everyone should be doing it? No, I don't. It should never be forced onto anyone. Like, to tell someone, hey, you should be more mindful. Well, that's just going to aggravate the very thing that makes them not be mindful. So why even tell them that? So that's what I wanted to clarify in that second question. I don't think it's for everyone, but I think everyone could benefit from it. Absolutely.
Yeah. So my second question, or my sort of last question here, I'm a big fan of Sam Harris. I'm sure you at least have heard of him.
Yeah, I'm a fan of his as well.
Okay. So he makes this big distinction between spirituality and religion. And, he talks about the sort of Western conception of, you hear people use this phrase, spiritual but not religious. And there are sort of two major reactions to that. Theists typically have the reaction of, well, you want all the benefits of a spiritual life without any of the responsibilities. You don't want to, be deferent to a god. You don't want to be beholden to some concept of sin. You just, you want your healing crystals and your meditation and your whatever. And then the sort of Western atheistic reaction is usually something more like, you're someone who's afraid of death but didn't pay enough attention in science class. How do you see the idea of spirituality sort of in that lens as something separate from religion?
Yeah, from my perspective, I had a problem with the word spirituality for a while. So when I started to have my concerns with my own beliefs, within the Mormon context. For me, the problem was none of these things really make sense anymore. So once I reached that state where things didn't seem to just make sense anymore, I was not interested. I was resentful towards religion and not interested at all in anything that even smelled of religion. So certain words that came from the religion, or from the context of religion, like faith, like spirituality, were very problematic for me because I didn't understand them in any other way than in the context of a religion or a belief. But what I found for me was I still wanted a sense of meaning. I wanted to understand, I found meaning in things without religion. The meaning I found just going for a walk in in nature, or spending quality time with my kids. Like, those things brought a lot of meaning. So for me, the word spirituality kind of evolved or transformed into this overall meaning of, or the overall need for connection and meaning in life. And I think we're hardwired, again, as humans. We're a very social species that survived because of our ability to live with strong social interdependencies. And I think that has obviously stuck with us. The worst thing you can do to someone in prison is put them in isolation. So that sense of connection and that sense of meaning, to me, that's spirituality. I've kind of just, in my mind, when someone says I'm spiritual, it just means, I need to have meaning and connection in life. And it's like, well, duh, we all do. So I think the only problem with spirituality is, again, the definition of it. How do you define it? That may be problematic. I define it in my head as connection and meaning. So when someone says I'm spiritual but not religious, I say, well, of course. I feel like what's interesting to me, if you look at spirituality as just connection and meaning, it's that need for connection and meaning that may drive you into a religion, into a set of beliefs, but it's also that sense of connection and meaning that may drive you out of a religion and out of a set of beliefs. So I think a lot of, an atheist, as an example, the moment I realize I don't believe what I thought I believed, I'm a non-believer, I'm an atheist, it's that sense of spirituality that's going to pull me out of my religion. I don't have a sense of meaning there. I no longer feel a sense of connection there. And if I didn't need connection and meaning, how easy would it be to just pretend and keep going? But most people can't do that. Why? Because they need connection and meaning. So I think it's kind of interesting how that, if you look at it that way, spirituality could be what takes you into religion, but it could also be what takes you out of religion. And in my case, it was the latter. It was, I didn't want to have any sense of dogmatism or beliefs or even religion in my life. And I struggled with it at first, even as I was studying Buddhism, where it's like, what am I getting myself into? But the more I practiced it, the more I realized, this, to me, I don't practice this as a religion. I don't view it as a religion. I don't identify as being religious. And yet I'm a Buddhist minister, which is because what I'm after is connection and meaning in life. So that's how I view that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And hence the title of your podcast and book, Secular Buddhism. I think that's a very fitting way of describing your approach to this philosophy and practice and these topics.
Yeah, and I would add to that, just as a caveat, who gets to define what spirituality is or what it means? So knowing that, I know some people will hear this and say, no, well, that's not right. I don't like that you're using that word spiritual. And it's like, well, if I was using it the way you think I'm using it, then I probably wouldn't like it either. But I'm using it the way it makes sense to me, which again is nothing more than just connection and meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Alex, are there any other things that you wanted to put on the table or questions that you had?
No, I think we covered everything that I think is really valuable about the practice and what I've gotten from it. I would agree with your definition of spirituality. It was something I I feel like I always felt growing up. I would kind of wander the woods, feeling like, oh, nature, this stuff, like valuing certain things and not really knowing why, and looking for that connection. And once I started meditating, it was easier for me to realize what I was looking for. And not that that's a really tangible thing, but it helped me look for it in other places than just wandering around nature.
Noah, are there any other topics you feel like we should cover here before we move on? Anything that you feel is vital to this conversation?
No. One thing, I just had a thought as you were explaining that feeling of walking through nature, which is exactly how I feel walking through nature. But as you were describing that, I was thinking of a family member of mine who's the opposite. Like, it would be absolute discomfort to have to go spend time in nature. So it made me think of this idea that, like, what may be a spiritual experience for you or for me, walking in nature, or some people love being out on the water in the ocean, and it evokes that same feeling, a connection to something bigger. For someone else, maybe a moment of sheer terror and sheer horror to have to even think about doing that. And yet again, for both people, like, they can be spiritual, they just find it in different things. And I think it's important to highlight that again as a summary of all of this is, for some people this works, for some people this doesn't work. Some people would find it horrifying to sit with your emotions and explore, look inward, right? So they would feel more comfortable going to a cathedral and sitting in there and looking at a statue of a deity, So yeah, I want to stress that fact that I don't think there's one spiritual path that's the right path. I think that's why there are so many spiritual paths and paths that are completely non-religious, because it works for someone, and we should recognize that and allow people to find their form of spirituality that works, and to honor that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. That's a beautiful way to wrap that topic. And with that, we're going to go ahead and transition to a segment we like to call the off topic. The off topic can be anything you want. It's, a philosophical idea, a charity you want to promote, something someone said to you in line at the grocery store that you thought was interesting, and we'll spend a couple minutes on it. So, Noah, what do you have for us?
Okay. So most of the time, if I have the chance to talk about something, I'm usually talking about Buddhism and mindfulness, or I'm talking to people about my other passion, which is flying and paragliding.
Yeah.
And so I think if I were to go off topic while still being on topic, it would be talking about the experience of paragliding, because I'm always trying to help people look inward and decide, hey, maybe that would be a fun hobby or sport. And so if you've ever had, those reoccurring dreams where you can, like, run and then you jump and realize you're flying, but only like 5 feet off the ground and not very fast. I don't know if you guys ever had those.
Yep. Yeah.
If you have, that's essentially what paramotoring is. You're flying low and slow, and it's just a really fun experience. And it's actually a lot easier to get into than most people think. I think a lot of people hear of any kind of flying sport or flying hobby and think, well, I would never be able to do that. It's probably really expensive. But paramotoring is very comparable to motorcycling. If you have a motorcycle, or you could get into motorcycling, you could get into paramotoring. So this is just one of those quick moments where I'm going to pitch paramotoring as a sport, because I thoroughly enjoy it, while at the same time, like I mentioned before, recognizing that it's not for everyone.
Yeah.
If you're afraid of heights, don't even think about it. Why would you do that to yourself? But then somehow wrapping this to everything we've been talking about, I do want to share, like, in the moment of training, it's very common that they'll attach you to a winch or like a four-wheeler of some sort and kind of tow you, and you start running, and the parachute or the wing kind of comes up over your head and then it pulls you up, and that's how you learn before you try it on your own with a motor. But I had this experience not long ago where I correlated and connected the dots of training with paragliding with that moment of being pulled. You're essentially a kite. And the moment you learn that you no longer need to be a kite, you can detach that rope. Now you've got the motor on your back. That's the big transition in paramotoring of, student to pilot. Now you go fly on your own. But it made me think about kites, and it made me think about paramotors. And the nature of a kite is that it will always work and work well when it's connected to a line and there's wind, right? That's the nature of a kite. And a kite is not inferior to a bird or to, something that's powering itself like a plane or a paramotor. And it really stuck with me, this thought of finding myself at times wishing that the kites in my life would be birds like me and go with their own powered flight. And realizing that a lot of the kites in my life feel a lot of concern and fear for me being a bird, saying, come attach yourself to this line again where it's safe and you've got structure and rules and ideologies to follow. So I just, again, wanted to kind of correlate this whole concept into being skillful enough to recognize that for some people who are kites, the right way to be right now in their life is attached to a dogma or an ideology or a set of beliefs. And some people in life don't do well connected to something like that, and they're off on their own figuring everything out their own way. And how beautiful it can be to recognize that a kite is a kite and a bird is a bird, and that the bird shouldn't want all kites to be birds and the kites shouldn't want all birds to be kites. And two of the saddest sights I think you could ever see is a kite that got cut loose when it didn't want to. It's going to flop and fall. Or to see a bird tethered to a line when it doesn't want to be. And how beautiful of a sight it is when you go to the park and you see a kite flying the way it's meant to up high, or when you see a bird flying the way it's meant to without any attachments to any lines. So I wanted to correlate that to my two passions, right? Flying, paramotoring, and again, mindfulness and Buddhism, all within this vein of being spiritual but not religious, or be spiritual and religious. Or don't be spiritual at all. Just be whatever you are and be a better whatever you already are.
I like it. That's a great way to bring it back around. I'm very enthusiastic about flying. Unfortunately, I don't actually have any flying hobby beyond simulators, but I really, really love, like flight simulators. I've got, the throttle and the joystick and the pedals and the head tracking thing. And I'm always somebody who's loved, flying for travel. And, I'm the opposite of afraid of heights. I love being up high. So at some point, paramotoring is definitely something I'm going to try.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm definitely comfortable on the ground. I think my dreams are not so much being 5 feet off the ground, but somehow jumping and launching 1,000 feet into the air and then trying to figure out how I'm going to land it. So, yeah.
Sounds like you might be more suited for being an astronaut or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, Noah, it's been awesome talking to you. I'm so glad we got to do this. Like Alex and I said before we started recording, we've been fans of the Secular Buddhism podcast for a long time. And I really enjoyed your new book, No-Nonsense Buddhism for Beginners. Many parts of our conversation today came out of that book and questions that are mirrored in that book, but there are plenty more. There's a lot more to get from that. So I recommend that book to everyone. And it's been great. I love this conversation. If people enjoyed hearing you talk or listening to your ideas or want to follow up with you, where can they find you? What sort of public presence do you have available for people?
So I have a couple of social media profiles. There's anything that's just my name, Noah Rasheta. That's Rasheta. On Instagram, that's my username. On Facebook, that's my username. if you follow me personally, you kind of find you'll follow a blend of some mindfulness stuff and a lot of paragliding and paramotor stuff. But I post most of my thoughts on mindfulness and quotes or anything that's mindfulness related under the Secular Buddhism brand, which is secularbuddhism.com, and Facebook, it's /Secular Buddhism, or Instagram /Secular Buddhism. Same with Twitter. So that's the handle. Secular Buddhism is where I kind of put all of that stuff. Or you can find me personally on noahrasheta.com, and same handle for all the social media sites.
All right.
Yeah. And I wanted to second I wanted to say that your podcast has been very helpful for me. Since it's probably been 4 years ago. I think I listened to it from like when you were on episode 2 or something.
Wow.
But that's been a really helpful thing for me and my girlfriend. So thank you for that.
Awesome. That's so cool to hear. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, of course.
All right. Thanks, Noah.
Cool. Well, thank you to both of you. It's always an honor to be interviewed in another podcast. And I know all the work and effort it takes to do podcasts. So thank you guys for what you're doing. And I appreciate you inviting me on your show. So thank you.
Thank you, Noah.